Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from being a good start to a great one. The commander we're discussing this week is truly an Artful dodger. Alela Artful Provocateur is a 4-mana Esper Fairy Warlock with Flying, Death Touch, and Lifelink. She's a 2/3, but she also gives our other creatures with Flying +1/+0, and best of all, whenever we cast an artifact or enchantment spell, she creates a 1/1 blue fairy creature token with Flying. Alela's page is a mixed bag of artifact, enchantment, flying, and fairy tribal strategies, but there's a fairly common thread amongst them, especially as we can see from some of these anthems. Remember, each one of these cards that we're looking at is also technically a creature token produced by Alela, so these anthems do work right away. Alela presents an awesome, but difficult challenge for us here, and it's because of her greatest asset, her versatility. Alela can be built to focus on artifact synergies, or to focus on enchantments, or to focus on flying creatures, or to focus on fairy tribal. This can be tough for us here when we're upping an average, because the average might contain components of several different strategies, but not do justice to any single one of them. But let's see what we can do. Alright, let's load up Alela's average deck list and import it into the Architect deck building website. Remember, the swaps we make must either be cost neutral or help lower the price of the overall list. It's rare to see such an equal number of artifacts, enchantments, and creatures. Commanders these days tend to be so specialized in a specific type that we don't often see such an even spread. This is just a testament to Alela's tremendous flexibility as a wily commander. The swaps I'd like to make fall into the following 3 categories: Jack of all trades, creature spells, and finally a section that I'll call Fly, My Pretties. Let's start with that first section. As the saying goes, a jack of all trades is a master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one. I don't wholly subscribe to that philosophy personally. I usually find that commanders flourish best when they are able to become a master of their trade. Staying in their lane becomes such a tight synergy amplification chamber that just explodes into tons of value. An elf tribal deck, for example, isn't necessarily going to want to be bogged down by a bunch of good stuff green cards. However, Alela absolutely fits the jack of all trades description perfectly. She actually can take the best pieces from a bunch of individual strategies to make her own unique identity. The trick is to make sure she never leans too far into any one singular strategy, or the cards that would just support one of those singular strategies. Enchantment payoffs, for example, aren't going to do a whole lot with a bunch of artifacts in the deck, and artifact enablers aren't going to do a whole lot with a bunch of flying creatures. It's a careful line to walk, but that's what makes it fun. So, Ethereum Sculptor reduces the cost of our artifact spells. A cool effect, and it would create a fairy token for us if Alela is in play when we cast it. It's a great choice for artifact-focused Alela decks, but given where this average list is, we don't have enough artifacts to justify a card that only specifically reduces the cost of less than a third of the deck. Now, if you're playing combos with cards like Sensei's Divining Top, cost reducers like this can be a huge boon. However, that type of combo doesn't seem to be present here in the average list, which makes me more comfortable with this chop. The same goes for Shimmer Dragon. This is a precon holdover, and it's quite a bit of mana for a fairly unruly effect. To be frank, I don't think this card would make the cut even in an artifact-focused build. There are so many non-artifact cards out there that care about artifacts that if we were to run those, we'd have to be very, very picky indeed. Psy Master Thopterist is a much tougher cut, but I again look at the number of artifacts and I can't really find enough to justify this one, even if he does make the occasional flying token. I turn my attention next to Mesa Enchantress and Archon of Sun's Grace. I love these cards. Like, it's tough for me to cut these cards. I want that to be known. I do not think these are bad cards. I think these are great cards. But like all cards, they depend upon context. They don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in an Alela deck with only 17 enchantments. They won't get the opportunity to shine here. If you're playing a dedicated Enchantress Alela deck, slam these for sure. But this average list just isn't committed enough for this juice to be worth the squeeze. You may have noticed a pattern starting to emerge with the card types I'm cutting, especially as I make my next cuts. Watcher of the Spheres is a lot like Ethereum Sculptor for us, only with even fewer targets. This thing getting temporary buffs from tokens entering just isn't really worth it. Remember, we're never just cutting a card, we're making room for something else later. Finally, we have Hannah Ship's Navigator and Arcanist's Owl. The owl looks good in theory, even triggering Alela to make a token when we cast it, but that mana cost is more awkward than it looks, and that ability is less useful than it looks. Hannah, meanwhile, takes a full turn and a minimum of 6 mana to recover dead artifacts and enchantments for us, and as revival goes for those permanent types, I'm just extremely underwhelmed. Alright Joe, you've been pretty ruthless on those creature cards, which is the pattern I mentioned earlier that you may have noticed already. I'm cutting a lot of creatures. Let's discuss the reasoning behind that in section 2. There's one very simple reason why I've cut so many creatures from the average list, and why I'll probably continue to cut more of them. Creatures, in a word, are just not that special for Alela. After all, every enchantment or artifact that we cast also comes with a creature attached. When we cast a mana rock, Alela makes a creature. When we cast an anthem, Alela makes a creature. When we cast enchantment-based removal, Alela makes a creature. That might seem like a small detail, but it's actually huge. We can deprioritize the creatures from this deck because any enchantment or artifact that we cast would come with free creatures tagged on. That means that any creatures we do play, they've got to be really, really worth it to actually make the cut, because otherwise we could just play some rockin' enchantment and get free bonus creatures that way. And specifically, there are some effects that we'd never find on creatures. They're only available on artifacts or enchantment cards. So when those come with a free creature, we get even more excited to deploy them. This is an effect I discussed a bit in the Tuvasa upping the average video. As these decks get tuned up, their removal gets more sophisticated, because casting removal effects provides a unique ability that will significantly hamper enemies while simultaneously pushing our own game plan forward. So let's get to it. The first section was all cuts, but this one is going to be a lot of adds. I'm starting off with a trifecta of Esper enchantments: Imprisoned in the Moon, Oubliette, and Aura of Silence, each one nastier than the last. Imprisoned in the Moon and Oubliette are astonishing ways of restricting enemy commanders in a way that our opponents will have a lot of trouble getting out from underneath. They join cards already in the average list, like Darksteel Mutation, as methods of binding our enemies while also providing a new fairy to our flying army. Aura of Silence, meanwhile, is one of the best and meanest white cards in the entire format. Play it, it's real good. Alright, this next part hurts. I'm adding graveyard hate effects to this deck. Two, in fact. Can this part be over already? My inner necromancer is screaming at me right now, but I cannot deny the power here. Soul Guide Lantern and Relic are cheap ways to create a token and keep powerful and popular grave strategies in check. That's value, even if my Marin deck is really mad about it right now. P.S. Some of these effects sometimes climb in price every so often, so if you're looking for a more budget-friendly version, I highly recommend Nihil Spellbomb in that spot. Alright, I want to take a brief departure from these removal effects and turn to the instants and sorceries, because there are two I've noticed that I'm pretty lukewarm on. Kaya's Wrath isn't really great, especially in a 3-color deck. I'm swapping it directly for Fumigate. It would gain us more life, and it's easier to cast. Then there's Mortify. This is an instant, but I'm more satisfied with the enchantment removal we just added, and it doesn't seem like we're hurting too much on interaction anyhow. I want to throw in a card that'll really mess with our opponent's creatures. Magus of the Moat. Only flying creatures can attack. And in most cases, that'll be just us. My whole family plays Magic, and my mom runs this card in 2 different flying decks, and it's probably her favorite card ever, because it often prevents everyone but her from engaging in combat. And even if they can, she's the ruler of the skies. Alela will have the exact same good fortune, able to shut down enemy stompies and outmaneuver everyone else in the air. Also, before I forget, this deck only shows 34 lands. That's really low, though for this deck specifically, it's not the absolute worst thing ever. We have a lot of mana rocks, many more than the average deck, which is awesome because then they can produce a fairy token if we draw them late game. More importantly though, our curve in this deck is very, very low. We discussed in our 2021 data update episode how the average converted mana cost of commander decks out there has gone to 3.33. Our Alela deck here though, its average mana cost is 2.89. Probably even lower after the cuts I just made on 4 and 6 drop creatures earlier. That's a lower average curve than Edgar Markov, a deck whose bread and butter is basically made up of all 1 and 2 drop vampires. All that said, I did remove a few cards that gestured towards mana assistance earlier though, so I want to just add one more land here. I'll make it Path of Ancestry, since it just got reprinted and it's basically an arcane sanctum that lets us scry when we cast a fairy, namely our commander. On the subject of fairies, that's another needle we have to thread, huh? Just like we couldn't deviate too far into Artifact or Enchantress, it can be dangerous to lean too far into Fairy Tribal too if we haven't given it enough support. A card like Scion of Una shows up in the average list, and I'm actually perfectly happy to keep it there because it buffs and protects our commander. That's perfectly good, and it demonstrates one of the ways that Alela can take the very best from each of her flexible gameplay options and combine them to still be very impressive. However, to add cards that I want to get to in our final section, I still have to make some more cuts, 3 to be exact, and they each fall along this line of fairies, which also means they'll be a little bit tough to explain. I'm talking specifically about Fairy Formation and Spell Stutter Sprite. The reason these are awkward to explain is because even though they have synergy as fairies, they are not exclusively fairy tribal cards. One just makes tokens and draws cards, while the other can use Alela's pre-existing number of fairies to become basically a counterspell. There's some honest-to-goodness awesome synergy going on there. Unfortunately, I personally find it just a little unreliable. I don't find that Alela needs a lot of extra help drawing cards and making fairy tokens, so Fairy Formation for me is replaceable by other enchantments that can give us tokens and card draw too. As for the Sprite, I came real close to keeping it. I really did. It's a creature and a counterspell after all. Even just having like 2 fairy tokens in play with Alela means that this can handle a lot of our enemies' spells that they try to throw our way. The tricky part for me was that it's pretty tough for this to counter the 7 and 8 mana spells that players start throwing around to end games. In my commander games, I often use counterspells defensively to protect my commander or to protect my own board, which Spell Stutter Sprite can totally do. But countering huge game-ending spells like a Torment of Hellfire where X equals 10, that's important too. Plus, there will be times when we've been massively set back on our board and this Sprite will have almost nothing to help it out. I'll believe anyone who tells me that this card is worth keeping, but I just personally happen to fall from 50-50 on it to like 49. The other thing I want to address is the matter of budget. That price tag from earlier probably looks really daunting, but here's a very important data point about it. Over half of the deck's budget is wrapped up in just like 5 cards, namely the Tutors and Bitter Blossom, all of which are like $40. Though I know it's a pain to watch someone cut awesome cards like these from a deck, I feel it's a bigger problem if I don't address the fact that you don't need expensive cards like these to make the deck work. For example, over 40% of Alela players are playing the card Bitter Blossom, which is a $40 card. We could build an entire deck for that amount. That said, this is the Upping the Average series, not the overhaul a deck to become super budget series. Just like it would be pretty disingenuous for us to deviate too far from the average in a strategical direction, leaning too far into one particular direction at the expense of the others, here we shouldn't necessarily make a habit out of cutting an expensive card just because it's expensive when 40% of players are actually playing it. I am going to make one chop on the basis of budget though, because I really want to hammer home that this isn't some pay-to-win type of deck. And especially I want to reiterate that you don't need a bunch of expensive cards for this thing to do what it wants to do. You could remove like 10 cards from this deck and it would fall from an average budget of $400 to like $150. And I'm being serious about that. I'm not even kidding about that figure. I wrote that line in my first draft of the script and then I looked at it and I was like, I don't know, Joe, that seems like maybe a bit of an exaggeration, right? So I did the math, and yeah, the 10 most expensive cards in the deck come to a collective price point of $254. They're great cards, but not everyone is dropping that kind of coin on commander decks. Play within your means, upgrade on your time, and while you do, I'ma just be here making recommendations for other cards that will get you a whole lot of bang without spending a huge buck. So with all that preamble, the card I'm chopping because of budget is Enlightened Tutor. If you own one of these, play it. But if you don't own one of these, you're good. If you don't own a Bitter Blossom, or D-Tutor, or a Cyclonic Rift, or whatever, that's also all good too. That's the point I want to try and hit home here. Alright, we've made some room, so let's finish things out by adding a bunch of new cards in our third and final section. Fly, my pretties! I made a point earlier of cutting cards that were a little too dedicated to specifically artifact or enchantress synergies, and I even cut some cards that were a bit too far-flung in the flying tribal direction, but I want to re-examine that flying aspect of the deck carefully here. The thing about those other specific strategies was that they require support unto themselves. I kept the best cards from each of those because those cards can help support Alela, but I didn't want to keep any cards that help enable the enablers. But there's still a strong through line here. The end result of playing a bunch of artifacts is that we get a bunch of flying tokens. The end result of playing a bunch of enchantments is that we get a bunch of flying tokens. There's a shared destination going on here. I don't want to lean too strongly into flying as an overarching theme for the deck, but it has not escaped my notice that the way this deck seems to want to end the game is with rather a number of flying tokens, but it needs some help to get there. Looking at the original average list, there's not a ton of game-ending spells there. So this section is for just that. We're going to embrace flying as a method of securing victory, and while we're at it, we're going to make sure that this deck has everything it needs to actually shut the door on the game. So I'm throwing in a Thunderclap Wyvern here to go alongside the Empyrean Eagle in the main board. I was torn between adding this or just adding some Anthem effect. I mean, even a Spear of Heliod would create a token and buff up the rest after all. But I want us to have some anthems that don't rely on our commander to become actual creatures. Plus, that flash is pretty tricksy. I actually have to chop another card to make more room too. I don't mind all that glitters, but I do have to give some side-eye to Mace of the Valiant. I want to like it, and I keep trying to force it into decks myself, but this card never seems to work out how I want it to, and it doesn't work great here either. Though it can be useful to have the occasional trick that helps us go tall instead of going wide so as to catch our opponents off guard, that element of surprise is lost when it takes this long to build up. Speaking of going wide, I'm adding 2 more Anthem effects this deck is extremely hungry for. The first is Cathar's Crusade, which is still relatively affordable depending on where you buy from, and which repeatedly buffs our tokens as we make more and more of them. The next is Gravitational Shift, which tips the scales directly in our favor. I was honestly pretty surprised not to see that one in the deck already. The next card I want to add is pretty new, but it helps us push an inexorable game plan while also allowing us to be a bit tricksy. We have Court of Grace, so now let's include Court of Ambition. We've got expendable, evasive tokens to help us hold on to the monarchy more easily, not to mention a good deal of protective enchantments that help keep enemies off our backs. This card can drain life totals even if combat becomes too complicated for us, and best of all, with Alela in play, it even comes with its own blocker. The final 2 cards I'm adding may seem strange at first to include in this last win condition section, but their versatility just cannot be understated, and honestly, I'm kinda kicking myself for having failed to include them in the Tuvasa upping the average video. Alela loves it when we cast those artifacts and enchantments, right? Well, how about some that we can cast over and over and over again? I'm adding Gossamer Chains and Flickering Ward. Both offer us protection, one from enemy aggro and the other from enemy removal against our commander. But more importantly, they each provide us with a steady train of fairies that our Anthem effects will pump into a lethal board state. These are excellent cards not just here, but in any Enchanter strategy. Give them a try, you won't be sorry. We're almost there, but you know what? Let's have a bonus utility land while we're at it. I'm gonna stuff a Blinkmoth Nexus in here. Let's say we have 3 Anthem enchantments in play, and almost have enough to take out one of our enemies. Boom! Backup flying creature in our mana base. Alela is all about little tricks exactly like this, so this is right at home. Alright, that ought to do it. The final list can be found in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've enjoyed the Artful Alela, and if she's provoked you to think of any other cool cards that you think your fellow players ought to be running in their decks too, make sure you leave those in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.